Okay, so good Shabbos, good Shabbos. All right, this week's parasha is called Parashat Behar. Of course, it is a short parasha because usually we read it in conjunction with next week's parasha, Bechukosai. But this year, of course, is a leap year, so we're reading Behar by itself. Now, Parashat Behar this week deals with the laws of the Shemitah, with land ownership and with loans, which explains why the Jews are so involved in money lending and real estate. We've been studying it every year of our life since 3,000 years ago, since we got the Torah. So let me give you a quick summary of the basics of what's going on in this week's parasha. So first of all, the law of Shemitah says that in the land of Israel, you're only allowed to farm the land for 6 years, and on the 7th year, the land of Israel itself has to rest. You're not allowed to harvest. You're not allowed to work the land, and you have to open your gates so that everyone who wants some food is allowed to come in and pick for themselves. Now, they're not allowed to come in with their own machinery and do a full-on harvest, but they're allowed to pick whatever they need for themselves during that 7th year. It's a land of peace. It's a land of joy. A year of peace and a year of joy. But then we have something called the Jubilee, right? Very well named with Jubilee. Right, the Jubilee happens every 50th year. So you've got the 49th year Shemitah, where you're not allowed to farm anything, which is very difficult as a farmer to leave the work for a year and not have an income for a year. But then the Jubilee year, the 50th year, is another year on top of that, another sabbatical year, where you're not allowed to farm the land. So for 2 years, you're not allowed to farm the land, which means you don't have a harvest for 3 years. So for 3 years, you don't have any income. It really is a difficult thing. And also in this week's parasha, we learn a little bit about the sale of land, which is also calculated according to the Shemitah years and the Jubilee, because the value of your property depends on the length of time up until the next Jubilee year. Because every 50th year, the land itself reverts back to its original tribal owners. So if you were to sell your land 25 years into a 50-year cycle, that person's only allowed to use your land for the next 25 years. In the 50th year, the Jubilee year, that land comes back to you. So you never actually sell your land. What you sell is you sell crops. Years of crops. That's what you're selling to someone. So they can buy your crops for the next, or your land to farm it for the next 25 years. They lease it from you basically. But in the 50th year, the original landowners get their land back. Now it's a weird commandment and weird laws that we're studying this week. And if you look at the way that Hashem looks towards these laws, they are actually extremely serious. The Pirkei Avot actually associates the laws of Shemitah with the laws of the 3 cardinal sins. You guys know what the 3 cardinal sins in Judaism are? You're not allowed to commit them no matter what. If someone holds a gun to your head and says, you shall do this, this, and this, and this, you have to say no, and you have to give up your life instead of committing those sins. The 3 cardinal sins are murder. You're not allowed to commit murder under any circumstances. Sexual immorality under any circumstances. And idolatry. Those 3. But the Pirkei Avot throws the laws of Shemitah in the same pool. It says, for those 3 sins and for the Shemitah, not keeping the Shemitah year, the people of Israel were exiled from the land of Israel. And they actually worked this out, that's saying that we were exiled into Babylon for 70 years, which was because of the 70 Shemitahs that we skipped before then. We had the commandment of the Shemitah, we said, hey, this is too difficult, we're not going to do it. And we tried it one year, we didn't do it, and we weren't punished. And we thought, hey, we can get away with this. And we kept on for the next 430 or so years, not keeping the Shemitah. And eventually Hashem came and brought the punishment, which was 70 years of exile because of the 70 Shemitahs that we missed. So it's serious, serious stuff. Now, looking at the Shemitah and the law and the idea of this, that you can farm for 6 years, but the 7th year you're not allowed to do any work, not allowed to have an income, you have to live off the land and see what happens. It's probably the most irrational commandment in the entire Bible. Who in their right mind would think of doing something like this to themselves? To force themselves every 7th year not to be able to have an income and to solely rely upon the Lord your God. And then comes the Jubilee. For 3 years you've got no income. How do you survive 3 years with no income? This is why our rabbis tell us the parasha is called Behar. Because what does Behar mean? Behar is a mountain. Behar Sinai. We remind ourselves that this commandment was given to us on Mount Sinai. It's a divine commandment from Hashem. Regardless of how difficult it is, we do it because Hashem said so. Now, one of the things that's discussed in this week's parasha and in next week's parasha of Bechukosai has to do with regards to the sale of your land. It actually says in the parasha that of course, you can sell your land for so many years up till the Jubilee, but you can also take your land and you can donate your land to the temple. And what happens then is that the temple treasurer takes your land, or the deed of your land for those years, and he actually goes and sells that land to someone else, takes the cash, and they use that cash for the temple's upkeep and the temple's maintenance. So if you want to donate your land to the temple, you can do that as well. They sell the land for you, they take that money, and they use it in the temple. But the thing is, if you donate your land to the temple, you do not get your land back in the Jubilee year. For good, you're giving it away. If you sell your land to a normal individual, you can get it back every 50th year in the Jubilee. But if you donate it to the temple, you never get it back. It belongs to the temple. What happens is that every 50th year, every Jubilee year, the land that you've donated to the temple is given to the Kohen who is in charge in that very year. He's the one that gets your land. They talk about this in next week's parashah, Leviticus chapter 27. So you never get your land back. You give it to the temple, and the temple keeps it, and every 50th year gives it to the Kohen who's in charge. But there is one exception to this rule. If the seller of the land is a Levite. But this raises another question. Can a Levite own land in Israel? Remember when we read about the splitting up of the land to the 12 tribes, and it's fuzzy maths, right? 12 tribes, but there's 13 tribes, because Joseph's sons both became a tribe, right? So there's actually 13 tribes. So the 12 tribes all get their tribal territory, but the Levites don't get any tribal territory, right? Actually, they do, sort of. Because we know that the Torah tells us that the Levites have to be camped around the cities of all 12 tribes. So throughout the land of Israel, the Levites actually get 48 different cities that are known as Levitical cities. Of those 48 cities, there are 6 cities that are set aside as cities of refuge. Remember that story? When someone inadvertently kills someone, if manslaughter happens, you have to run away before the next of kin comes to take revenge on you. You can run to one of those 6 Levitical cities. Those are 6 of the 48 cities that the Levites actually have. And in addition to those 48 cities that the Levites get, because you need a local Levite. So all 12 tribes need their local Levites living just outside their own cities. So all of those Levites that live in those cities, they also have a small portion of land around their city as well. So in a way, the Levites sort of do get a portion of land, but it's not a set portion of land in one place. It's scattered all over Israel so that they can live among the 12 tribes. Okay, so they do get a little piece of land, not as much as the other tribes. It's like that famous joke of the 3 guys who are all bragging about the size of the plots that they own. Those 3 oaks here in South Africa, they were bragging about it. Where the one guy comes and he speaks and he says, I have over 600 square miles of land. Land in the city of gold. I've got mines in every square mile of my land. I'm going to call it the city of gold one day, but its name is going to be named after me. My name is Johannes the third. So we're going to call it Johannesburg. So he looks at the guy next to him and says, No, what land do you have? And the guy says, My name is Frikkie. I have about, let's say, 200 square miles of land. It's very beautiful, nice rolling hills, very many jacarandas in the streets. One day it's going to be the capital of this country. My surname is Pretoria, so we're going to call it Pretoria. And then they look at the third guy, a Jewish fellow, Sandy Levy. And they look at him and they say, Hey, what about you? How much land have you got? You got anything to offer to us, yeah? And he says, Sorry guys, I'm not anywhere close to your square meterage. I only have 1 square mile of land, but I can guarantee you, it's much better than both of yours put together. They say, Sandy Levy, what are you going to call it? He says, Santon. The richest square mile in Africa. So it's like that with the Levites, right? The Levites don't have the same square mileage as the rest of us, but their square mileage packs a punch, very much like old Sandy Levy. Okay, so the Levites don't have much land. And the thing is, can they sell that land that they do have? It's a bit tricky. The thing is, the Torah tells us that they can donate their land to the temple. But it differs from a regular Israelite. Remember I just told you, if a regular Israelite donates his land to the temple, it's gone. He can never get it back. The 50th year it goes to the Kohen. It doesn't come back to him. If a Levite donates his land to the temple, he can get it back anytime he wants. The Torah says that the land of the Levites belongs to them as their internal inheritance. They can keep it permanently. It doesn't go to the temple, doesn't go to the Kohen. The temple can use it and sell it, but anytime he wants to redeem it, the Levite can go redeem it at a moment's notice, because it's God's portion for them. And Rashi comes along and explains this to us in this week's parasha as the context of Leviticus chapter 25, verse 34. So let me read to you guys quickly. Leviticus 25, I'm going to start in verse 32 to give you something else here, and then we'll read 34, which is Rashi's commentary. All right, it says here, Leviticus 25, 32, concerning the cities of the Levites and the houses in the cities they possess. Remember, you can sell your house as well, hey? The Levites are to have a permanent right of redemption. If someone purchases a house from one of the Levites, then the house he sold in the city where he owns the property will revert to him in the Jubilee, because the houses in the cities of the Levites are their tribe's possessions among the people of Israel. So when it comes to selling your house, the regular Israelite, if you were to sell your house in a walled city, you don't get it back in the Jubilee. It's not the same as your field. If you sell a house, the Torah tells us as a regular Israelite, you're only allowed to redeem it within 1 year. If you miss it after that 1 year because you, I don't know, lost your job or whatever, it's gone forever. You can't get your house back in the Jubilee. But as for the Levite, Hashem says it is permanently their houses. They can redeem it and they can get that house back in the Jubilee year. That's when it comes to the houses. Now listen to verse 34. Verse 34 says, the fields in the open land around the Levite cities may not be sold. So this is now the Levite field, because that is their permanent possession. So the plain reading here makes it sound like the Levites can't sell any of their land, but Rashi points out for us what it's actually talking about here, because elsewhere in the Torah, we actually do see that the Levites are selling and buying land. For example, Jeremiah. You know, Jeremiah was a Levite. The book of Jeremiah tells us about him buying and selling land as well. So they can actually buy and sell land. But Rashi comes and explains that this verse is specifically talking about Levite land that is permanently going to be theirs, so it can never actually be sold. The fact that a Levite can go and buy back or redeem his land any moment he wants means that the Levite land can never truly be sold. He can sell it quickly just for a little while, but he can take it back any time he wants. That's what this verse is actually telling us according to Rashi. But one of the things the Levites can do is they can also donate their land to the temple. It's in next week's parasha, Leviticus 27. And what happens then is the treasurer can sell the crop yield of that land, but the land itself is always available to the Levite to redeem any time he wishes. Don't even worry about the Jubilee. He can do it any time he wants. That land always belongs to the Levite. Okay, so these laws are quite complex. And I am not an expert in these laws of land and how to judge the things. But when I was reading it, it did bring out something in my mind, a story from the New Testament that I want to look at today. So our very first believers, our early believers, they all had an issue with the temple. They didn't really want to donate to the temple. Reason being, the temple was run by those corrupt Sadducees. So what did they do? They still followed this week's parasha. They still sold off their land in Israel and worked it out according to the Jubilee and all these things. But instead of giving that money to the temple, our first believers used that money and gave it to the Jerusalem Messianic community. The community of believers, Jewish believers in Jerusalem. We called it our HQ, right? Our headquarters for Messianic Judaism. That community that lived in Jerusalem, we would give them the donations. And they actually had a name. They were called the Evionim. What does Evionim mean? The Ebionites. It means the poor ones. Now, one of the reasons why we called them the poor ones was because of this very thing. The Jerusalem community was very, I almost want to say communist, but not exactly communist. All of them in Jerusalem, they sold everything they had, took that money and put it into a pool, and let our apostles decide how to distribute that money to keep everyone going. So they were called the poor ones, but they weren't necessarily poor. They were actually all looked after because they all had this communal fund which they lived under. Only the Jerusalem community, by the way, okay? Not the Galilee community, not the Southern Israel community, not the diaspora community. There's only the Jerusalem community that did this. Kind of a little bit socialist, but not exactly, because there were still lots of people that were donating and keeping them going and giving them places to stay and using their property as like little synagogues for them to gather as well. But this is what they would do. They would sell their land and they would give the money to the Jerusalem community to keep them going. In fact, we see Paul doing this. Paul, when he traveled around Asia Minor, he went to all the Messianic communities in the diaspora, collected money, and sent the money back to the Jerusalem community, specifically to keep them going. It was headed by old James, the brother of Messiah. So I want to read to you something that happens in the book of Acts. In Acts chapter 4 and chapter 5, we see the writer Luke making a comparison between two types of people that sell their land and donate it to our HQ, our Messianic community in Jerusalem. And it teaches us a lesson about how serious Hashem is with these commandments. So let me take you to Acts chapter 4, verse 32. It says the following. All the many believers were one in heart and soul, and no one claimed any of his possessions for himself, but everyone shared everything that he had. So they would put it into a pool, and then our apostles would decide how to make sure that everyone's got whatever they need. With great power, the emissaries continued testifying to the resurrection of the Lord Yeshua, and they were held in high regard. No one among them was poor, since those who owned lands or houses sold them and turned over the proceeds to the emissaries to distribute to each according to his need. Thus Joseph, whom the emissaries called Barnabas, the exhorter, who was a Levite and a native of Cyprus, sold a field which belonged to him and brought the money to the emissaries. So here's the first guy that the book of Acts tells us about. This guy's name is Joseph, but eventually they called him Barnabas, which could mean the exhorter. Or another option is that it means Barnabua, which means the son of the prophets, because Barnabas became a famous prophet among the early believing community. Right? Good guy. He sold his land, his property, and gave it to the emissaries. Now, what land do you think he sold? Anyone want to take a guess? What does it tell us about him? He's a Levite. So, can a Levite sell his land? Not really. Right? We read about the ways that Levites can buy and sell land, but it always belongs to them. So it's a bit of a weird one. So maybe he sold his Levitical land in the land of Israel, but I think it's more likely that he actually sold the land that he had in Cyprus, because it's telling us he was a native of Cyprus. So he probably sold his land in Cyprus and gave all of that money to the Messianic community in Jerusalem and said, here it is, guys, I'm joining you as one of the Evyonim. I'm going to join this society. So that's a very good guy. Okay. Now listen to what Acts does in the very next verse. Chapter 5, verse 1. It tells us about someone else. But there was a man named Hananiah, who with his wife Shapphira sold some property, and with his wife's knowledge withheld some of the proceeds for himself, although he did bring the rest to the emissaries. Remember, we just said this is what they were doing. They were selling everything they had. We just read there that none of them had any possessions for himself. Everyone that was in this community sold everything they had and gave it to the emissaries and lived in this communal lifestyle in Jerusalem. This guy and his wife sold the stuff but kept some of the money in his pocket and said, I want to join this community. With his wife's knowledge, withheld some of the proceeds for himself, although he did bring the rest to the emissaries. Then Peter said to him, why has Satan so filled your heart that you lie to the Ruach HaKodesh and keep back some of the money that you received for the land? Before you sold it, the property was yours. And after you sold it, the money was yours to use as you please. It's yours. You own it, right? So what made you decide to do such a thing? You have lied not to human beings, but you've lied to God. On hearing these words, Hananiah fell down dead, and everyone heard about it and was terrified. Do you know what you call this when God kills someone divinely on the spot without anyone touching him? We call it karet. In the Torah, it's actually one of the punishments. For certain sins that you do, the punishment, God says, will be karet. You'll be cut off from your people. This is what it means to be cut off from your people. Death by divine touch or divine kiss. So he died in front of them. The young men got up, wrapped his body in a shroud, carried him out, and buried him. So it talks about shrouds here. You guys know that how we do the Jewish funeral rites. We use these shrouds called tachrechin. They did this with this guy right there on the spot. Now listen to this. Some 3 hours later, his wife came in, unaware of what had happened. She didn't even know her husband got buried. She walks in. Peter challenges her and says, tell me, is it true that you sold the land for such and such price? So he says the price that they told him, the lie. And she says, yes, that is what we were paid for it. So now she's twisting the words like Eve did as well in the garden. But Peter came back at her and said, then why did you people plot to test the Spirit of the Lord? Listen, the men who buried your husband are at the door, and they will carry you out too. And instantly she collapsed at his feet and died. The young men entered, found her there dead, carried her out and buried her beside her husband. As a result of this, great fear came over the whole Messianic community, and indeed over everyone who heard about it. All right. Have you ever heard people talk about the God of the Old Testament is this God that's vicious and bloodthirsty and murderous, whereas the God of the New Testament is full of grace? This story is in the New Testament, ladies and gentlemen. What does it show us? It shows us how important these laws are to Hashem. Don't think you can wipe them under the carpet. Firstly, the laws of land ownership and the donations that we do with them, and also that we don't financially cheat our brother. You know, it's actually a mitzvah in this week's parashah. Leviticus 25 verse 14 to 17 says the following: if you sell anything to your neighbor or buy anything from him, neither of you is to exploit one another. This is what they did. This is the mitzvah they broke and were killed for. Rather, you are to take into account the number of years of the Jubilee when you buy land from your neighbor, and he is to sell you according to the number of years of crops that will be raised. If the number of years remaining is large, you will raise the price. If it's few, then you will lower the price, because what he is really selling you is the number of crops to be produced. Thus, you are not to take advantage of each other, but you are to fear your God, for I am Adonai, your God. This story in Acts really brought the fear of the Lord into the community to remind them how Hashem sees these laws. Lest we think that these laws are archaic or things of old, like the Israelites did originally when we didn't keep the Shemitah for the first 430 years. And we were punished by 70 years of exile. The punishment took a while, it took a few generations, but eventually that punishment did come around in the form of exile. So the story in the book of Acts reminds us of how serious Hashem is about the laws in this week's parashah. And we should be as well. This is one way that we can fear the Lord our God. Let's be honest with each other in our dealings. Don't cheat your brother, knowing that at any moment we can also be cut off from our people. Are you scared? Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom.